I bought my first car at 14 and restored it with my dad in his garage. By the time I was 17, that car had been on the cover of Hot Rod. It had been on the cover of 2 different Mustang magazines and had a major feature in Carve magazine. I still wake up every day with a pit in my stomach. Every day. I wake up at 4:30 in the morning. I start to work very early. Every day I go, okay, what do I need to focus on today? What can go wrong? How do I get out of it?
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Horsepower Heritage. I'm Maurice Merrick, and greetings to all of you listening far and wide from places like Chantilly, Virginia, Alpharetta, Georgia, Breckenridge, Colorado, Dakar, Senegal, Guimarães, Portugal, and Edinburgh, Scotland. If you're a new listener, thanks for checking out the show. I try to mix it up for you, and we talk about everything from hot rods to hypercars, but it's always about the people and stories behind the machines. You can also find Horsepower Heritage on Instagram and on YouTube. Lots of good stuff for you over there as well. Now, let me tell you about today's episode, because if you've ever thought about turning your automotive passions into a career, there are plenty of ways to do that. And you don't have to be a restoration expert or a racing driver or an auctioneer. This may be the first time you've ever heard of Dan Kahn, but I guarantee you've seen his company's work. And as a matter of fact, you've heard some of his clients right here on this show. Kahn Media handles marketing and public relations for some of the biggest names out there: Lotus, Maserati, Aprilia Motorcycles, Roush Performance, the Ring Brothers, Lucid Motors, and the list goes on and on. And as you're about to hear, Dan's early career and his insights on the digital revolution allowed him to build a team of enthusiasts who have helped to bring the commerce of car culture to a new level. Dan is also a lifelong gearhead, and we talked about a few of his personal car projects and his thoughts on where the automotive space is going and what the future might mean for all of us who care about cars and motorcycles, not just as mere transportation, but as a powerful cultural phenomenon. So I think you'll enjoy our conversation. Don't forget to follow Horsepower Heritage on your favorite podcast app and leave me 5 stars and a quick review. When you do that, it really helps us reach new listeners. We're closing in now on the 3rd anniversary of the podcast, and I have so many great things in the pipeline, but I depend on all of you to extend the reach of the show and make it bigger and better. It's more important than you know. Now, stay right there, because I know you're going to love this great conversation with Dan Kahn of Kahn Media. And that's coming up right after this. Hey guys, Maurice Merrick here, and I'm just checking out what's new at modelcitizendiecast.com. And let me tell you about some of these Porsches. First, there's a 911 SC from the 1978 Safari Rally, and that's in Martini livery. Or a 911S from the 1966 24 Hours of Le Mans. Or a 904 GTS from the 65 12 Hours of Sebring. All of these cars are in 1/43rd scale by Spark, and they've got terrific details and amazing paint jobs. And best of all, they can fit just about anywhere, from your desktop to your dashboard. There's plenty more to see at modelcitizendiecast.com. Use the promo code HERITAGE at checkout to get 10% off your order. Limitations apply. From race cars to street cars and everything in between, it's Model Citizen Diecast. Because your inner child still wants to play with cars. Dan Kahn, thanks for having me in today. First of all, I really admire what you've done as an entrepreneur, and the way you've been able to meld cars and your profession it's kind of magical.
Thank you. I appreciate that very much.
And I just want to express my appreciation to you. You guys have put your trust in me with your clients, and it means the world.
Well, thank you. And likewise, I've been watching what you're doing for a while. I'm super impressed. I love the hustle. I love anybody who tries to start their own thing. And you've been super polished since day one. My team loves working with you. You've been just a gentleman. You do what you say you're going to do. So it's been a pleasure. So I've been looking forward to this too. I'm excited.
Oh, I'm glad. First of all, what is Kahn Media?
So the short answer is we say we're an integrated marketing agency. That sounds like a bunch of sort of meaningless business buzzwords. We were originally a public relations agency. And we can talk about this a little bit, but sort of the definition of public relations has changed a lot over the years. So we handle PR, marketing, digital, social, and content creation for mostly automotive, luxury lifestyle, and outdoor brands.
And you've really found a niche in the automotive space, but you've also got intimate knowledge of car culture and automotive that most firms of your type wouldn't have.
Yeah, I would say from day one, that has always been sort of our pitch and our competitive advantage is I'm a pretty hardcore car guy. I try to only hire enthusiasts whenever possible. And I'm sort of a generalist, right? So I like a lot of different types of car culture, and I know a little bit about a lot of different things.
So it's a mile wide and an inch deep type situation.
Yeah. And I am I a hardcore Porsche guy? No. Do I appreciate Porsches? Yes. Do I know enough to get by in a conversation? Yes. But I also can talk to you about off-road racing. I can also talk to you about, superbike racing. I can also talk about snowmobile racing. So and when it comes to car collecting, concours, and the sort of more pre-war stuff and even hot rodding and domestic stuff, muscle cars, I generally, like you said, I know a little bit about a lot of things.
Was this a boyhood thing? Is that where it started for you?
Yeah, I grew up in a family of car people, and I grew up in Southern California, which doesn't hurt when it comes to car culture.
Absolutely not.
And my grandfather was like a Great Depression era car guy, so he was super mechanical. He grew up in Chicago. He was the son of immigrants. But again, he grew up in the Great Depression. So for him, he was very mechanical and he liked cars. And all the way up to the day he died, he was a car guy, but he was like a restoration car guy. So he had a 37 Ford that was totally stock and restored. He liked Cadillac LaSalle's. He was sort of more of that kind of very proud to be an American, liked American ingenuity, but he thought performance, hot rodding, racing, he thought that was all kind of frivolous. So for him, he didn't really understand the whole modification side of things.
Right.
And then my dad is the prototype boomer car guy, literally grew up cruising Van Nuys Boulevard, doing the whole American graffiti thing. His first car was a 55 Chevy, with a Duntov 3030 cam and all that kind of early 60s.
Period speed equipment.
All of it.
By the way, did he keep his cars or did he sell and get something else and lose interest? And
I wish we're pretty solidly middle class.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, I think that, it would have been great if he could have kept everything, and he'd be one of those guys now who's, my dad's still around. He's 75. And if he was still around and had all those cars, he'd be living pretty great. He does have a good life, but unfortunately he was always one of those guys where he had to sell one thing to get to the next. And now when you look back on sort of the archives of what he owned, it's pretty insane. He had he bought a 66 Shelby new, got bored with it after a year, and then got a 67 GT500 new, and then saved up his money. And a year later, he had a friend who had sort of introduced him to the whole Ferrari thing. So he bought a 275 GTB4 long nose.
Oh no.
And it was 6 months old. Bought it and it was his daily driver. And he has all these photos of this car, and it's one of the most outrageous Ferraris of all time.
Oh yeah. He
kept it for a year, loved it, and then it was time for a tune-up. And those 4Cam cars, the tune-ups were, I think, even in the 60s, they were $1,000 or something, like huge money at the time.
Yeah.
And he couldn't afford the tune-up. So he sold the car at a loss. And I don't remember the exact number, but I think he bought it for $7,000 and sold it for $6,000. That car now is worth over $1 million. And at one point it was worth, I think, about $1.5 million. And then replaced it with a Pontiac GTO. So today, but he's constantly kind of been cycling through. And
well, that's 99% of us car enthusiasts. You got to sell one to get one.
Yeah.
It's just how life is. Garage space is at a limit, and the kids need school books and all of that.
I remember when I was a kid, he had, so this would be early 80s, he had a 308 GTSI. And it was a relatively new car. I think it was only maybe 2 or 3 years old. And that was when Magnum was on TV. And that was like the coolest car on the planet to me. I thought that car was so cool. And then he had a bad year at business and at work, and he had bills to pay and a mortgage to pay. And so he sold it. And I remember as a kid, I was just crushed. I couldn't understand it. I was heartbroken that he sold it. And then I think a couple of years later, business got better and he bought like a Corvette or something like that. But in my mind, I was like, nothing is ever going to be cooler than that 308. Like, how dare you? Why'd you sell it? But now as an adult with kids,
You understand.
I've been in that position. I've done it. So I get it. So I grew up kind of in that environment. And so my dad is not a sports guy. My grandpa wasn't really a sports guy. So for me, not to get all kind of Freudian on you, but I think for me as a little kid, if I wanted to connect with the men in my family, it was at the car level. That was sort of how I was going to connect. So I was wrenching on stuff when I was little. I was crewing on race boats when I was in my early teens. I bought my first car at 14 and restored it with my dad in his garage.
What was that?
It was a 68 Mustang Fastback.
Cool.
Yeah, it was a total beater. Didn't run when I bought it at 14. We did a complete ground up restoration. And at 16, I finished it. And it was admittedly for a home restored car. It was beautiful. And I didn't know it at the time, but I actually started doing PR at 16 because this is back pre-email. I went out and shot a bunch of pictures of it and wrote up a little article about it and sent this little packet of photos and this little write-up to a bunch of different magazines that I like to read, saying, hey, I'm 16 and I restored this car with my dad and check it out and you should do an article on it. And I ended up in 1 year, by the time I was 17, that car had been on the cover of Hot Rod. It had been the cover of 2 different Mustang magazines and had a major feature in Carve magazine.
Wow.
So yeah, that was sort of, for me, that was an eye-opener because, I think with car people in my life growing up, it was purely a hobby. My dad is an HVAC contractor. His dad was also an HVAC contractor. A lot of the adults in my family are teachers. So to me, that was sort of a novel concept. It didn't really sink in at first that like, even my first job in high school was working the counter at a speed shop. I did that because it was fun. And I did that because I got a discount. So I could buy parts less expensively. It never really sunk in until I was probably a senior in high school that I was working at the school newspaper. I had kind of had a little bit of success getting my car publicized, not knowing the word publicized yet. But just knowing that I'd gotten my car in these magazines. And that's when it finally started to click that, wait a second, I wonder if I could actually do this for a living. Like I can actually like write about cars and talk about cars and somehow get paid for it. And even to my family, they were kind of like, what are you talking about? That's not a job. But as it turns out, here we are.
And you have a journalism degree, right?
I do. So I had a very pivotal moment that senior year in high school where I wrote, so my favorite magazine at the time, unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. It was called Carcraft. And the reason I liked Carcraft is it had a much snarkier tone than a lot of the other car magazines on the newsstand. There was like the guys that like Car and Driver and Road Track. And today, by the way, I love those magazines, but
Carcraft was for garage guys.
It was for garage guys. They covered street racing. They had kind of, even the editorial, the editorial section was always kind of had a little bit of attitude, a little bit of snark. So as a teenager, I thought that was funny. They also had a lot of cute girls in their photos, which as a teenager,
you can't argue with that.
Yeah, I wasn't opposed to that. And so I liked that attitude. So I wrote a letter to a couple of the editors at that magazine at the time and said, hey, I love your magazine and I want to learn more about what you do. Not expecting a response. And Peterson Publishing was in LA. I was in the suburbs of LA, about an hour away. And they wrote back and they said, well, why don't you come down here and we'll take you to lunch and we'll tell you about this job. And so as a senior in high school, I'd never driven over the hill into the city. And I'm doing it in a Mustang with, a big cam and high compression and a 4-speed and 411 gears and, tacking 4,000 RPM on the freeway going like, oh my God, this is crazy. I've never driven this far before.
Up through the Cahuenga Pass.
Yeah. And like driving down Wilshire. And I'm like, this is like, for me, that was an adventure. And I get to 6420 Wilshire, which is the old Peterson Publishing building. And they took me out to lunch. And it was 2 junior editors, Miles Cook and John Kuix. And they took me out to lunch and they sat me down and they said, do not pursue this. This is a terrible idea. straight up. They just were like, you're going to be underpaid. You're going to be overworked. It's very challenging to earn a living doing this for a living, especially living in Southern California where the cost of living is really high. It's just a terrible idea all the way around. You shouldn't do it. And what I heard was, this is awesome. You should totally do it. So, I mean, I'm literally walking around and I'm looking in these offices when I met them for lunch before we went to the burger place. And like Gray Baskerville, who was this like legendary automotive journalist, was just walking down the hallway. And, you know, I look in some other guy's office and he's got like a blower motor on a stand next to his desk. And I'm going like, these are my people. And so for me, I was that was it. I knew at that point, okay, I got to get a journalism degree. I need to start getting some bylines beyond my high school paper. So immediately after high school, I started working on that degree. I started working full time. I think at a couple different points through college, I had 3 different jobs while going to school full time, writing for a few different car magazines. I was also writing for Weeder Publications, which has since been sold, but they had like...
As in Joe Weeder.
Joe Weeder, yep. So I wrote
fitness guy, yeah.
And I wrote for Men's Fitness. I wrote for Muscle and Fitness. I wrote for Flex, which like Flex is like the really big, huge, like Mr. Olympia guys. Not my thing, but whatever. I was getting paid to write articles. So
were you a lifter?
I was not. And at that time, I didn't even like go to the gym. And I'm going in there and I'm surrounded by these guys where like Arnold would come in because Schwarzenegger was friends with Joe Weeder. And like he'd come into the office. And even Joe at the time was in his 60s and was yoked. Yeah. So there's these like big buff guys walking around and I'd sit at the lunchroom and I'm like eating my sandwich going like, what am I doing here? And these guys are eating like 9 chicken breasts before they go, you know, hit the gym. Because they were all like super hardcore power lifters. Right. And that was actually like at the time, it was such a weird experience because it was so not my world, but it also taught me to be fearless because I'm being asked to write articles about things I knew nothing about. But it was a great experience because it taught me that, look, if you're willing to ask questions and listen to the answer and learn, you can write an article about anything. So it was good. At the same time, I worked for a startup tech magazine called the T Sector, and it only lasted 2 or 3 years. But that was at the very beginning. I remember one of the first articles we wrote about was about Qualcomm and the first smartphone. So that kind of shows you how long ago. This was like way pre-iPhone, right? But at the time, again, I think they had a website and they had a print magazine and they were publishing content on both simultaneously. I had never heard of that before. That was a totally new concept.
Nobody was doing it.
No. And if you did have a website, which almost no media companies did back then, you were doing that. They had this insane thing where they were doing these like 30, 60, 90-day lags intentionally where they'd publish the print content first. And then they would wait 3 months and then put the web content up because they didn't want to cannibalize their audience for the print magazine with web. And what these guys figured out is no, people in the tech industry aren't going to wait 90 days for news in our industry. They want to read it as it's breaking.
Right.
So we're going to put the news that's breaking on the website and we're going to put the long form deep dive feature content in the print magazine. That's a model that even now is still kind of, a lot of these bigger media companies are still figuring that out. So I think they were way ahead of their time. It was just that was such a new concept. I think they were a little too early with it. So unfortunately that one didn't last. But
you know, Dan, it's easy to forget that there was a time when nobody could quite figure out how to monetize the internet.
Right.
It was just chaotic.
You're right. And I think that the AI thing is probably going to be a similar situation. I don't think we're just dipping our toe into that water, but I think it's going to be a similar level of disruption because those early days, you're absolutely right. They did not know how to monetize it. They didn't know how to compete with it. And then the third company I worked for through college, which was such an interesting contrast because we had like the big established polished company in Weeder. We had the startup culture in this tech magazine. And then I worked for this little tiny company called Challenge Publications. So it was in the Valley. My parents' neighbor was an editor for them at a mountain biking magazine. And it was hardcore niche audience print magazine. So they had mountain biking, road biking. They had 3 different car magazines. They had an aviation magazine. They had a couple of like sea and ship type magazines for like people who were into like military vessels, really, and like train collecting magazines, like really that stuff at the very back of the newsstand. That was like the really hardcore niche stuff.
Right.
That was where they lived. It was kind of a dumpy office. And I mean, the paychecks would bounce occasionally. It was a pretty rough deal, but I think if it had been a bigger, more polished company, I don't think they would have hired me because I was young and didn't know what I was doing. But they hired me, and within a few months, I was the editor of 2 different magazines at the same time. So now all of a sudden I have all this responsibility and I have to create all this content. I had never held an SLR camera, and they're going like, hey, you got to go shoot your own photos. You got to write your own stories. I'm getting press releases back in then it was actually in the snail mail. So I'm getting press releases and trying to figure out how to turn them into articles. And it was this unbelievable experience where, I mean, I have those magazines still, and I look back at them and I'm totally embarrassed at how kind of poor the quality was. But at the time, I was a one-man ship and I was doing it. I was getting stuff done and I was figuring it out. And it was a huge learning experience for me. So I think that positioned me for later, my career to then go get that job at Peterson Publishing and then go into PR. And it was a great learning experience.
Huge confidence builder.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
At what point did you say to yourself, the publishing business is not my future. My future is in marketing and PR and events and...
Yeah. So good question. And it's interesting, and bear with me for a minute because this is all going to come full circle. But I had a job offer waiting after college. I went straight to Peterson Publishing, which was where I wanted to go. Like, remember that whole lunch in high school, right? Like, this was what I was working towards. All of a sudden, I have a cubicle at 6420 Wilshire. I'm on the same floor as Motor Trend and Hot Rod and Carcraft. I'm going like, oh my gosh, this is it. And it was amazing. And there was a window of time there that was incredible. And within about a year or so of me starting there, Mr. Peterson sold the company, and he sold it to private equity. And I didn't even know what that was back then, right? I didn't know what private equity meant. All I knew was Mr. Peterson, who I used to see in the parking garage, and he had a Ferrari Super America. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this guy's my hero. So he sells the company to some guys, I think they were English businessmen. And then they immediately, within like 6 months, they flip the company. They like reduce costs. They do what PE guys do, right? So they cut costs, pump up the price, they flip it. Well, it flips 2 or 3 times. And all of a sudden, the new owners are now our former competitors at another publishing company. And they come to an entire floor of our company and say, hey, we're going to move your entire team to Anaheim. So now suddenly I'm living in LA. I'm driving to Anaheim every day. And for your listeners that are not in Southern California, that's like a 3-hour commute in traffic each way.
Yeah, it's murder.
And so I'm doing that, and I'm looking at this print thing, and I'm going like, why? They don't have a plan for digital. So I started looking for a new opportunity. Edmunds.com was sort of a car shopping site, and I had gotten word they wanted to build out an editorial team. So I kind of hounded the editor at the time just repeatedly and sort of wouldn't leave him alone until he hired me.
And by the way, Dan, just for context, this is like 99, 2000?
This would have been like 02.
Okay, yeah. Because I remember Edmunds made a pretty big splash in the late 90s, early 2000s because they were all of a sudden they were a disruptor in the valuation game.
So that happened first, and they absolutely were. They came in and blew Kelly out of the water for a little while there, and like all of a sudden you could go online and you could just look up values for free. You didn't have to subscribe to a literal book like the Blue Book that would show up. And so then on the tail end of that, they said, hey, we need editorial content. And they had brought this guy, Carl Brower, over, who was a former Peterson guy, had been at Super Street, had been some of the other Peterson titles. And I just started kind of haranguing Carl until he hired me as a road test editor, and I could drive a little bit. So I'd go do track testing and I could write. And so I showed up on their team, and that was such a huge moment for me because suddenly I'm learning the digital space. I'm learning digital publishing, fast turnaround. And I'll never forget the first 2-3 long lead events I went where an OEM would have a new car rollout. And they would bring in all these media. And that was also an exposure for me to PR at a level I hadn't had up to that point. Because working for like Rod and Custom and Hot Rod and some of these car kind of enthusiast magazines, we didn't go on a lot of like press trips or things like that. Well, now all of a sudden I'm going to OEM press trips. I'm exposed to sort of more of a polished level of automotive PR I didn't know existed. So I'm sort of soaking all that up. I was also the redheaded stepchild at every event I went to. Because, and it's not an exaggeration, and these guys, a lot of whom I still know, and I'm friends with these guys now, but at the time, you had these similar age to me, so 20-something-year-old writers, but for the print kind of established car magazines, who would literally make like nasty comments because, oh, that's the website guy. And it was so funny at the time because they're like, they would look down their nose at the blogs and the websites, like this lower form of content. And I learned a lot, and it was this huge opportunity. But as you've probably heard over the years, that was kind of during the whole dot-com boom. And there was a moment there where it was like super high energy. I remember the first time I heard the word blog. I'm like, that's a weird word. And it was exciting. And we learned about the pace of digital publishing, which was, keep in mind, if you were a staffer at a print magazine back in the 90s and early 2000s, you were getting paid full-time salary and benefits to write 2 or 3 articles a month. And you're getting paid and living up. And everyone's talking about how hard they're working, but the reality is the pace is pretty low key.
Yeah.
Well, all of a sudden you work for a digital publication and you're writing 2 or 3 articles a day.
Right. The churn.
That was like, on one hand, it was a game changer, but it was also a real business model disruptor. It's why the print industry sort of collapsed. And so it got me accustomed to that sort of pace of work. But to be totally candid, it also burned me out. So after a couple of years of that, I was just kind of, I wish I could tell you this, like the clouds parted and this voice came down and said, you should be in PR. But the reality is I was so cooked from just maintaining that pace for a couple of years that one day I just said, I can't do this anymore. And I quit. And I had just bought my first house. And it was a fixer-upper in the San Fernando Valley that I probably couldn't have afforded. And I kind of just said, well, I'll get some roommates and figure it out. And then I quit. And now all of a sudden I'm 2 months into the home ownership experience, quit my job with no backup plan. I went, oh my God, that was a terrible decision. How am I going to pay my mortgage? And because I was in that situation, I was sort of desperate and had to figure something out. And one of my closest friends who was kind of trained as a photographer, and he and I had worked together back in the Peterson days, he had gone to work for a small PR agency that was actually owned by 2 former magazine guys, mostly doing motorsports and a little bit of aftermarket stuff. And he said, hey, you can write, you can talk. Why don't you come work for us and do PR until you get your next gig? And my assumption was it'd be another editorial gig. Okay, I'll do that. Hey, it pays the bills. And so I started working for them, and boy, it was an immediate click. As soon as week 1, I went, wait, I can write about cars. I can talk about cars. I can be involved in the creative process. I actually have more control over the content that I'm working on because it's client side. I don't have some editor just giving me assignments whether I like them or not.
Right.
And I have this like kind of feedback where I can be involved in more than just like, on editorial, you write a piece of copy and you turn it in and you kind of don't see it again until it gets published. But on the PR side, because we were we were involved in creating narratives, coming up with storylines, coming up with campaigns, working with graphic designers, working with photographers, coming up with ad campaigns, working on sort of the more kind of cohesive program all the way across. All of a sudden now it was a much more stimulating environment for me, and I loved it, and it kind of clicked.
So what was the name of that company?
It was called Auto Media 2000.
Okay.
It was a mouthful.
What a 2000s name, right?
Totally.
Like, hey, it's a new century.
And I think in the night they founded the company in like 95 or 96. And so like Auto Media 2000 sounded very futuristic. And by the time I worked there in like 03, 04, we're like, why are we calling this 2000? But
right.
It was okay.
So it reminds me of that movie Death Race 2000.
Right. Yep.
So funny. So when was it that it clicked for you? Like, hey, I can have my own name on the door.
So it's funny. I really wasn't looking for anything new. And a headhunter called one day and said, hey, we have an opening at this other agency. It's a much bigger agency and much bigger accounts. And we want someone who's a car guy. We really need a car person on these accounts. And it was working on like, Meguiar's at the time, the car care company. I think they had like Aston Martin and the owner, Joe Molina, had sort of a mixed reputation. He was known by everybody. He was a real pioneer. He was in business for like 40-something years. But he also had a reputation for being pretty tough on employees. And I had heard that reputation. I went, I don't really know if I want to go that way or not. And so I threw a number at him that would have effectively doubled my salary. And at that time, I had just gotten engaged to my now wife. And I thought that would be the end of the conversation. And they came back and said, okay. At that point, I'm like, well, I just got myself into a pickle because I've got this job I really like, working for these bosses that are really nice. In theory, I could go to this other place and work on these really cool accounts, but for this guy that has this reputation that's sort of a question mark. But boy, the money would be pretty good, and I'm about to get married, and I want to go on a honeymoon, and I want to have kids one day. And so I took the job,
What decided it for you? Because that's quite a crossroads.
It is. And to make it even more complicated, at the same time, my dad, who runs his own HVAC company, was kind of lobbying for me to come work with him and eventually take over his business. So I had this like triple fork in the road. Do I go work with my dad? Do I go work for JMPR? Or do I kind of stay at this job I'm really happy with? And as much as I wanted to kind of take on the family business, I kind of knew in my heart that like I'd spend the rest of my life selling air conditioning units, kind of wishing I was doing the car thing. The other two options were both pretty solid. And the way I actually made that decision was I went to the bosses at Auto Media, and this has been a through line through my entire life and my careers. I'm a big believer in being sort of open, honest, and transparent. And sometimes that means you have to have very tough conversations, but I've never regretted sort of just telling it how it is. And so I just went to them and said, here's what's going on. And here's this offer that's been made, and I'm seriously considering it. And it wasn't like I'm squeezing you guys for more money. It was just, I'm telling you what's going on, and I'm not sure how to handle it. And they could not have been more gracious. And they said, look, I'm sure you've heard the reputation of that agency. They tend to kind of grind through employees. At the same time, we can't even touch that number. And we don't have those kinds of accounts. And we get that if you want to work on sports car accounts, that'd be pretty cool. So you should take it. And if it doesn't work out, you have a home here. You can come back.
Well, obviously, you had made your reputation there, and they knew who you were, quality guy.
Yeah, I hope
so. So it's great that when an employer leaves the door open.
It was, for me, that was the first interaction I had in a workplace where they treated me that way. Where, I mean, not that I left on bad terms in other places, but it's taken me 15 years of owning my own business to really fully appreciate how rare and special that is.
I was going to say it's a very exceptional case.
It is. And it showed the kind of the content of their character, I think, as people. So I took the job, and everything I thought about that job ended up being accurate. It was a huge learning experience. It was, the accounts were incredible. We got to have some amazing experiences. It was every bit as challenging and stressful a work environment as I had been warned that it would be. Again, 15 years into owning my own agency, I have now sort of reconnected with Joe, and I've actually circled back to him. I've even written about it on my LinkedIn to kind of say, at the time, I was really resentful of some of the things that he said and did. And now I wake up every day finding myself feeling and saying very similar things because I realized that a lot of what motivated him as a business owner was the survival of his business.
Right.
And at the time, I didn't understand that and I didn't appreciate it. But what the impetus that actually pushed me over the edge into owning my own agency was that I was keenly aware of the development of not only the internet, but also of social. And to me, I'm watching as social is just exploding. There's a guy who's still around named Brian Solis, who was an agency owner at the time, who wrote a book called PR 2.0. And he was talking about how the interactive web was going to totally transform public relations. I had read a lot of books on the matter. I was in an MBA program with my wife at the time. She was like loving it. I was sort of not loving it, but kind of trying to get through it. But it stimulated sort of a lot of ideas in my mind. And I ended up spending every night and weekend for months writing a business plan for the agency where I was. And the idea was to do a hard pivot and say, look, we're always going to have an element of our business where we're calling traditional journalists, we're writing press releases, we're setting up press events, we're doing that sort of old school tactical PR stuff. But if we can be first to market, helping our clients have a direct-to-consumer conversation through social and through digital, and if we can help them curate their own voice and tell their own story without that filter of a third party, whether it's a journalist or whatever, through those social channels, that's a tremendously powerful tool. And it would also give us some competitive advantage, even against the big agencies, you know, the Edelmans and the Rogers and Cowans and all that. And I presented that to the owner of the agency and to the leadership team, and they listened, and they gave me some staff development time. And I think we got through one sort of, and I wrote a book on it, and it was an internal handbook. I still have it somewhere. It was like a 250-page bound thing. I had them printed at Kinko's when that was still a thing. And I presented it to everybody and said, this is our guidebook, and I'm going to teach you guys how to sort of do this. And we're going to hold our clients' hands, and we're going to walk them into this new kind of way of communicating. And after one meeting, some of the other managers came back to the ownership and said, hey, this is a waste of time. Let's just get back to work. And so he came to me and said, okay, we're going to nix this whole thing. Just get back to writing press releases. And I stewed on that for about a month. And at the time, my wife had a good job in the aerospace industry, making good money with good benefits. And she said, why don't you chase it?
So you had a little bit of a safety net.
I did. I think if she hadn't had that job, I'd probably still be working there. But because I knew okay, we've got our bills covered, we've got health care.
You're not going to starve.
We're not going to starve. And you know what? I knew at the time I have marketable skills. So I thought I can go out and try this thing. I'll give it 6 months or a year. If it works, great. If it doesn't, I can go get another job.
Plus you had Auto Media 2000 with that open door if you needed it.
Exactly. So that was November of 2008.
Wow. Do you remember your first client?
I do. Hotchkiss Suspension.
Oh, wow.
Road racing.
Right.
Yeah. A lot of bolt-on. A-arms, control arms, coil springs.
Yeah.
They were my first client. Second client was Redline Oil, which now is owned by Phillips 66, but at the time was independently owned oil company. They took a gamble on me and we were off to the races.
The pace of the change has been frantic in the digital space, right? I mean, how do you maintain authenticity, especially in an environment now where so much on social media is contrived?
Yeah, boy, it's noisy.
It's really noisy. There's a lot of noise and very little signal.
So our sort of North Star since day one is we are constantly trying to figure out the best, most authentic way to connect a brand with their consumer. And their consumer might be a B2B audience. Maybe they don't sell direct to you and me. Maybe they're a services business.
Back of the house type.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or maybe they are selling direct to consumer, or maybe, whatever it is, we figure out who that brand is, who their customer is, and how do we start curating a connection and a relationship between that brand and that target audience. And we are constantly looking for whatever that new thing is. So day one of the agency, it was me and a video guy. And that was totally unheard of in '08. To have a PR agency, not an ad agency, and not a graphic designer, not an account executive, not some sales guy. My first hire was a video guy. And the reason why was I figured out very early on, at the time, there were very few people posting video content on social. And social back then, this is pre-Instagram, it was mostly Facebook.
Right.
And I think MySpace had already kind of mostly gone away. So if you were the first one to the party with video, you're going to have much more engaging content than anybody else.
And YouTube at the time was some cat videos and...
Yeah. There was actually a website called Street Fire that was a Flash-based video player for mostly automotive content it predated YouTube. And that was before Google even bought YouTube. So we were very early to YouTube. We were on Street Fire. We were on these different channels.
I don't remember Street Fire, Dan, but I know you remember E-Bombs World.
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Which was oh, wow, this is clickbait video 101 right here. They kind of established that.
They did. No, yeah. It's just how do you hook that audience, right?
Yeah.
So when it was video, we were first on video. I mean, to this day, we still have a really robust video team, and actually their editing bays are 10 feet from where we're sitting right now. We've always had that. It's still something we do, but there's a lot more. Like today, if you look at TikTok, Instagram, even Facebook, the Reels thing have now contributed to all that noise, right? We're just getting bombarded with all this stuff. We were the very first to market in our space to start offering digital marketing. So not organic social, but paid, targeted social content where we're going after whether it's geofenced or interest or lookalike audiences, where we're saying, hey, we're going to create organic, engaging content, not some schlocky infomercial, but a piece of content about a brand or about a product or service, and we're going to deliver it to the type of customer that they want to engage with.
It's a piece of content that has inherent value beyond the marketing message. Is 100%. That fair to say?
Yep.
Yeah.
And so we were very early to that space. We've been doing that for 7 years now, and now other agencies are only now coming online with those kind of services. Honestly, during the pandemic, we had, just like everybody else on the planet, that first 5-6 months of COVID when we're all on lockdown. Well, for me, a huge part of our revenue stream as an agency are promoting things that were sort of not happening during the lockdown. And I thought, well, okay, this is obviously a challenge. So we're going to have to figure out how to navigate through it. And so we had to come up with new ways to keep our employees busy, because I was afraid if I let anyone go when things kind of came back, we'd be understaffed. So we got really aggressive with our own content, with our own newsletters, with social for the agency, not just for the clients. But at the same time, we're going like, well, if everyone's locked in their houses for, at the time, I think it was going to be 6 weeks, and then it was 6 months, and then it was a couple of years. In my head, I'm like, knowing my own experience, which is I miss seeing my friends and I miss that social connection. And I think people are going to want to get together again. And like for me, even just going to a local Cars and Coffee and walking around and seeing my friends on a Saturday morning, even if it's a local thing, is really gratifying. I like that experience. I think a lot of people do, right?
Yeah, it's a ritual that you get accustomed to. And we're all so busy that when there is an opportunity, an excuse to get together, we grab it.
Totally. So for me, I'm looking at that going, okay, are trade shows going to go away? No, I think there's a need for trade shows. And I think we've since seen that most of these trade shows have come back in a big way, and we actually work with a lot of them. But I also saw a need during that lockdown that if we can create experiential events and you get to authenticity, this is where things can really become meaningful. It's really hard to create a connection and a bond with somebody under the fluorescent lights of a convention center. They have a value because there's a volume game there, right? That's quantity maybe over quality. You're going to connect with 100,000 people over a 3-day trade show. So that's good. But there's also, I think, a value to that quality component where if you can have a much smaller, more curated experiential event where you're demoing a product or a vehicle or a service in the environment that is intended to be used, that brand or that brand representative can have a meaningful connection with a journalist or an influencer or a consumer, that has value. So we actually launched our events division during COVID when all the events were canceled, saying, let's build out this idea, let's build out this program. And then when this whole thing blows over, we're ready to rock and roll.
It's like getting your car tuned and set up in the off season.
That's right.
It's exactly what it is.
And as a result, we now, this year, we're going to be, we have like 9 experiential events across the different agencies that we manage on the outdoor side, on the automotive side, on the motorsport side that we produce. We do some for our clients, like OEMs. We do some that we have produced as an agency that are more kind of focused on general markets. But we do that literally to create those authentic connections and bonds between brands and consumers or media.
What are some of those events we're talking about? I think people ought to know.
Yeah, so Kahn Media is the parent agency, and then we have a sister agency that's kind of a division called Tread that's more focused on the outdoor, off-road, overland kind of space. On the Kahn Media side, we're actually helping a few different OEMs, Maserati, Pininfarina, Lotus, a few other clients, curate their own events. So like in Monterey Car Week, we'll rent a house or a facility. We will bring in talent, we'll bring in food, we'll bring in catering, we'll bring in chefs, we'll bring in the vehicles. And we literally will bring out media, we'll bring out influencers, we'll bring in their target demo customers. And we're doing ride and drive experiences. We're going to have sort of experiential programming. We did a thing with FlexJet earlier in the year where they actually, we brought them into a wine festival, knowing who that's that kind of fractional ownership of business jets, where we had stemware created with their logos. We had this art piece created specifically for the event that has wine kind of pouring through this sort of like sculpture.
Sounds like my kind of party.
It was cool. And the whole idea is, okay, there aren't like, well, maybe there are BizJet enthusiasts, but that's not who our audience is, right? Our audience is just affluent people who want to get from point A to point B without going through like
TSA,
the pain of TSA.
Yeah.
So how do we go to an event and connect those people with this brand so they say, hey, I'm interested in this? On the Tread side, we have a couple different events that we're putting on that we're calling the Traction Series. And like one of them is this backcountry summit that we're doing on a huge piece of private forest land in Bozeman, Montana, or outside Bozeman. We're bringing in media influencers from that kind of outdoor space, and we're going to teach them skill sets, and there's going to be brands there to kind of demo their products during that experience. So we have a lady who's a biologist from the Park Service who's one of the only currently working biologists who is a survivor of a grizzly bear attack. And she's going to come in and talk about sort of wildlife survival skills, how to kind of get through a forest situation if you are encountering sort of an apex predator. We have a marine recon sniper who's going to come in and teach long-range shooting skills. We have a survivalist who's actually been on Naked and Afraid in I think 1, 2, or 3 seasons, who's going to come in and talk about like, hey, if you're in an emergency situation in the wild.
And you're naked?
Yeah, like here's how to find shelter. Here's how to start a fire. Here's how to forage for food. Kind of hardcore, but we're getting these journalists and these influencers great content creation experiences, and also like this really fun story they can go tell their audience, while also sort of seamlessly baking in brands that make products that would actually fit that narrative.
Right. And by the way, somebody listening to this is thinking, marketing, blah, blah, blah. But whether you realize it or not, your car choices, the choice of parts you buy, the car events you attend, it's all being influenced whether you know it or not. And we've got cultural trends. You're riding the wave of that, right? But you're also helping create it.
Yeah, it's funny because it's pretty common knowledge in car circles, I think, that like the general sort of accepted knowledge is that whatever the current generation is kind of moving the collector car market. They're chasing the stuff that they wanted in high school and they couldn't afford.
Right.
So for like my dad, who graduated from high school in 1965, for him, like a Hemi Cuda was the holy grail, because when he was in high school in like 1964, nobody could afford a Hemi Cuda. That was like totally outrageous, right?
Right.
They were all driving stuff that was like 15-year-old hot rods because that was all they could afford. They'd buy what they could afford and they'd kind of hop them up and make them faster. So when he was in his like late 60s, what does he do? He goes out and he buys a Hemi Cuda, because now he's at a point in his life where he's got a little bit of money saved away and he's kind of, his house is paid off. And he's like, okay, I'm going to buy the Hemi Cuda. And every generation wants that, right? Like my grandpa that I referenced earlier was a Great Depression guy. He always wanted that Cadillac LaSalle because that was a rich guy car.
Aspirational.
Right. When in the 30s, when he was a poor teenager, that was like a dream car, and they could barely afford to eat. So to him, that was that aspirational car, right? So it's interesting that, the 90s thing now is huge, right? If you look at the value of the Acura NSX, if you look at, the Gen 4 Toyota Supra, if you look at all these kind of performance vehicles from that era that are now, like, they were always cheap, they were always plentiful. I saw a 93 Mustang Cobra R the other day on Bring a Trailer go for like $250,000. Like, that was an expensive car when it was new, but it was like 20 grand.
Right.
So now all of a sudden they're exploding. Well, are they super valuable because that's what the current generation wants? Are they super valuable because all the car magazines are now reporting on the fact that, hey, you should go buy these cars? Or like same thing would be like those kind of the classic SUVs that have exploded now, like K5 Blazers and Scouts and, 66 to 77 Broncos, and like all those things now are huge.
Square body Chevys, bump side Fords.
Totally.
Yeah.
Like huge money now, where like, you could buy a square body for a couple $1,000s not that long ago. And now if you want a half-ton short box that's not rusted out, you're looking at $25,000 for a starter truck.
Yeah. And then the fully restored ones are going for 75, 95. Yeah.
Crazy money.
Where's the ceiling on those? I wonder.
And Roadster Shop is making turnkey chassis for square bodies.
Yep.
And so you have to kind of wonder, like, is the media reporting on it pumping the values up? Is the media reporting on it because consumers are buying them and that the values have already gone up based on supply and demand? Is it sort of an ecosystem? I think it's probably an ecosystem.
Yeah.
But certainly we have our role to play in it. And kind of my particular job is also helping the brands that are kind of working on those trends to say, hey, let's stay ahead of it. We had clients who called the OBS thing, which is like the 88 to 98, I think, body style Chevy pickup truck. 6-7 years ago, they said, hey, that OBS body style Chevy pickup, they were kind of the last of the analog vehicles. They're easy to work on, parts are plentiful, there's 1 million of them out there, rear wheel drive, V8, pretty fun to drive. And in a Tesla sort of dominated world, it's a pretty fun analog experience that's cheap. So we had a ton of clients, 5-6 years ago that started rolling out products for that body style. Now those are crazy money.
Yeah.
So it's sort of interesting that sort of cyclical thing keeps happening. And what's the next one? I don't know.
Cultural currents is really what we're talking about. And so I suspect the answer is no, Dan, but was there a big break moment?
I mean, actually, the answer is yes and no. There was never the big break moment in terms of like, I have arrived.
Right.
And like that never really happened, to be honest. And I think this is probably the case for a lot of entrepreneurs. 15 years in, we now have 33 employees in 9 states. We're running 2 agencies. I still wake up every day with a pit in my stomach. Mm-hmm. Every day. I wake up at 4:30 in the morning. I start to work very early. Every day I go, okay, what do I need to focus on today? What can go wrong? How do I get ahead of it? But there was, I think, one of the tipping points was I met a guy fairly early in the agency, maybe 3 or 4 years in, named Terry Cargus, who has since become a mentor and a friend and a father figure. And so he's a very important part of my life. And Terry has had this really cool career. He has been involved in different levels of motorsports for decades. He actually did motorsports sponsorship sales for Budweiser in the 70s. He worked with Phil Hill. Back when Caitlyn Jenner was Bruce Jenner, he handled all, because he handled all of her motorsports management and sports management. Worked with Dan Gurney. So he's got a career in our industry going back.
Roger Penske too.
Yeah, Penske. Yeah. Yep. And so, 50 years but also a promotions guy, worked at SeaWorld, worked for Disney, has had this sort of really kind of wild career. And when I met Terry, he had just come off of a 17 or 18 year stint at Roush. He was an EVP at Roush. And he was kind of doing some consulting work for this tier 1 OEM supplier that we were working with as well. And that's when we first connected. And he only worked with those guys for about a year when all of a sudden he got hired to be the executive director of the Peterson Museum. And I had already known Terry. We had already done some work together on some of these other projects. And as soon as he got to the Peterson, and I'll never forget, because he got hired like a week before Car Week. So all of a sudden, my friend and client who, was working on like truck parts with us, suddenly is the executive director of the Peterson. I remember he rolled onto the lawn at Pebble in a 47 Ferrari Barchetta, or maybe it was a 48 Barchetta. And I'm going like, wow, that's a pretty cool fairy tale moment. And he came up to me at Pebble and said, we're going to hire you as agency of record for the Peterson.
Wow.
And that relationship, both with Terry, with the Peterson, as that evolved with many of the Peterson board members, people like Bruce Meyer and Peter Mullen, Michael Hammer, who passed away, unfortunately, this past year. Those guys, I have learned so much from them. These are all super successful business people. They're super well respected in the car community and in the business community. And that has been a game changer for us.
They're all men of integrity. And by the way, I had lunch with Terry not that long ago. He's going to come on the show. I'm really excited about doing that. So
excellent.
Yeah. The mentorship aspect you're touching on is really important too. Because you don't have to, even if you've got 15 or 20 years of your career under your belt, you've got the institutional knowledge and the Rolodex and all that, you can still use a mentor.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to this day, on a semi-regular basis, I'll either call Terry up or ask him to go to dinner just to get his take on things. And one of the things I've learned in middle age is that wisdom is something that you can only accumulate with time. And you can be the smartest guy in the room, but that does not necessarily mean you're the wisest person in the room. It often means quite the opposite, right? And so that wisdom thing is substantial, and that relationship both with Terry and with the museum, a lot of fruit has kind of grown from that tree.
Yeah, it's funny the difference between theoretical knowledge and experience, where those two kind of overlap. That's kind of where wisdom begins, I think.
That's
not
right.
to get too philosophical, but it's true. SEMA is a big deal for you.
It is.
And talk about your involvement with SEMA, because it is the industry trade show for everything from wheels all the way to electronics, you name it.
Yeah, I first experienced SEMA as an 18-year-old. I walked out on the show floor for the first time and was completely floored. I mean, I had no concept up until that moment how big the industry was, how big SEMA was. I think anyone who's been to the show, with that first time you walk out onto the floor, it is shocking because you get there and there's 100,000 square feet. I think it's like 1 million square feet of show floor space and 100,000 people. And it's also the largest gathering of small businesses in America. Not a lot of people realize that.
Did not know that.
It's a pretty interesting thing to experience for the first time. So early on, first SEMA show I went to, first media trade conference I went to, I remember seeing these people like walking around with these badges that said SEMA, and I'm like, oh, what's that? And as it turns out, oh, they're volunteers. And the entire leadership of this organization are all volunteers, and they're all industry people, and that's really cool. And so it's interesting that I early on sort of recognized that maybe there's an opportunity there to learn. And so I got involved fairly early on as a volunteer, but I didn't really get super involved until I started Kahn Media. So about 15 years ago, year one of the business, I raised my hand. I joined their networking group for young leaders. At first, it was originally for people under 30. Then they moved it to people under 40. At the time, it was called YEN, which was the Young Enthusiast Network or Young Executives Network, I think. It's since been changed to a different name, Future Leader Network. I ended up becoming chairman of that group. And then I went from there to a few other volunteer positions and eventually was elected to the board of directors. I served 2 full terms on their board until I basically termed out. You can only do 6 years. And that was a wild ride. I mean, we were there through a lot of change in our industry. And I was on the board all the way through COVID, which when you run a second biggest trade show in Vegas and have to cancel it, that's a big lift. I mean, that's a, for the industry, that was a challenge for the, Vegas community. That's a lot of people's jobs are connected to things like CES and SEMA. So that was a pretty challenging and interesting time. And as soon as I left the board, I was approached by SEMA leadership to say, when they said, hey, we know you have a lot of opinions about PR and marketing, and now that you're not on the board anymore, why don't you put them to work for us? So they hired us as their agency. We are still their agency of record. And that's also been an interesting experience because like we've talked about even on today's show, our industry is undergoing massive change right now. Everything from kind of changes in social and changes in media and information dissemination to consumer behavior, those trends we were talking about a little while ago. Look at electrification. There's a lot fewer moving parts in an electric car than there are in an internal combustion car. That's replacement parts. That's opportunities for modification. So that's sort of remapping the entire aftermarket in real time. So being part of that conversation has been fascinating just to see how SEMA, which does a lot, like they're a trade show, they're also an advocacy group. They have a very robust office in Washington, D.C. that are working with ledge-reg stuff with EPA and with the federal government. They have a team that works with state governments. And as I'm sure you and your listeners are aware, there's a lot of sort of new regulations happening right now that are going to have impacts on car people.
Yeah, I cannot say that I'm optimistic about any of that stuff. I'm actually very dubious of a lot of it, frankly. What makes me uneasy and what I object to is they're trying to regulate the market administratively and legislatively in certain areas, but that makes me uneasy. And just talking about public policy and the marketplace, if you're an individual who wants to be a small business owner and you can build a better mousetrap, you should be able to do that without being like funneled in one direction or another. You're a good example of that. There's so much regulatory interference now. Where is the American dream? Where does that fit into the picture?
I am not ashamed to say I am a hardcore free market capitalist.
Yeah.
And that system seems to work a lot better than some of the other stuff around the world historically. And when you try and sort of do an end run around that, it doesn't typically end well. And I just saw on the news the other day that now some of the European Union countries that were super hardcore into this whole EV thing are going like, well, turns out when the natural gas that powers our power stations gets harder to come by, it's a little harder to charge your EV, and maybe we need to loosen up some of these standards. So, I do think I am a pro-innovation person. And I think like one of the things about the SEMA show that I think is excellent is last year, actually for 2 years in a row, we had an EV showcase. And to me, there are components of that I think are brilliant. I think if you are a person that is interested in electrification, just like if you wanted to swap a late model LS motor into your 53 Corvette, I think you should be allowed to do that. And I think that's cool. And if you want to restore that 53 Corvette with a Blue Flame 6 and keep it totally stock, I think you should be able to do that. Well, if that guy wants to go do a Tesla swap in his 53 Corvette, more power to you. I think that's interesting. And anytime anyone's innovating just to try and learn something new, try something new, I think that's great. And that EV showcase, I think, was excellent in that they had all sorts of different people there where they had everything from modern sort of bespoke electric hypercars to classic cars that are EV swapped. And I think, again, if that's something you're interested in, I met some guys with a company called Raglan that are both former military guys that are restoring vintage Land Rover Defenders, and they're putting Tesla drivetrains in them using the factory transfer case. So it's still four-wheel drive, still has kind of the same suspension setup. It's an EV. Hey, I think if somebody was interested in doing that, I think that's great. I just don't want the government telling me I'm not allowed to have any choice. You have to buy that jelly bean shaped EV Jetsons car. You don't get to have that other option. That's where things get a little sticky. And to be honest, I think there's a lot of people in this country, if you look at kind of what's been happening with like John Deere and how farmers kind of banded together to sue and say, hey, you know, when John Deere basically tried to control farmers and say, you're not allowed to work on your own tractor anymore. You have to take it to our service center and you have to use our computer with our software package, because even though you bought that tractor, we own the IP. Farmers banded together and sued John Deere and won. And to me, that's a huge moment for the car industry, because I think that it's the same thing here, whereas automotive enthusiasts, that's kind of, we should be able to choose how we, what we want to drive and if we're going to work on our own stuff or not. And it's interesting because one of the other market forces that's kind of reshaping SEMA and the aftermarket and the automotive industry is actually private equity. And, earlier in this conversation, I talked about Peterson, right? And I went to work for Mr. Peterson. Robert E. Peterson was a Hollywood publicist. He had an idea. He went to the LA Armory, the first Roadster show. And this is just after World War II. He sees a bunch of these World War II vet young guys that got mechanical training working on airplanes over in Europe and Japan. And they came back and they said, hey, I'm going to hop up this old Model A, or I'm going to hop up this 32 Ford with some parts that some guy named Vic Edelbrock or Ed Iskandarian is grinding in his garage, and I'm going to make it faster. Well, Pete saw an opportunity there. And he said, hey, let's make a program for the next show. Well, that program ended up becoming Hot Rod Magazine. He starts Motor Trend. He builds an empire. He sells it for $400 million and change. That's the American dream. He was completely self-made. I have a picture of him in the hallway for a reason. Well, then the PE guys get involved. And again, I don't mean to be negative. A lot of our great clients are PE owned. But in general, their business is flipping businesses, right? So they buy Peterson, they kind of cut costs, they increase prices, they get their margins looking really good, they flip it. The next company does the same thing, the next company does the same thing. Well, that's happening in the aftermarket right now in a huge way. There's a lot of these sort of first gen and second gen innovators that came up with a better suspension design, came up with a different idea for a wheel design, came up with a different supercharger idea, came up with a new idea for a different type of fuel system. They ground out that idea in their home garage or some little rental unit somewhere. They build a business, they grow it. Well, eventually they want to retire. Maybe their kid doesn't want to take over, so they sell it. And that business gets added to a group of other like-minded businesses, and then they sell that group to another private equity company, and they build that one up and they sell that. That's not bad. Those guys are making money just like everybody else, and they certainly have a right to. But something gets lost in that shuffle. Where kind of like we were talking about earlier, that sort of that connection, that authenticity, all of a sudden when you have one sales team and one marketing team trying to handle 5, 10, 15, 20 brands, thousands of products, it's pretty hard to have that intimate connection with your consumer and with your audience. And so suddenly that gets diminished. And there was a moment there for a couple of years where I was watching all this M&A activity happening in the aftermarket, happening quite literally on the floor of the SEMA show. As where there was 10 booths, now there's one big super group has one booth. A lot of that happened in the truck space particularly. And I went, man, this is bad. Like what's happening? It's going to take our little tiny multi-billion-dollar industry that feels like a family, and it's going to sort of dilute and reduce the impact it has. It's going to eliminate opportunities. But then a funny thing happened. As a super group goes in and buys 10 or 15 different truck parts manufacturers and kind of mushes them into one big company, all of a sudden this guy comes along who says, well, I have a better idea for a cargo management system for pickup trucks. So I'm going to roll that out of my home garage and I'm going to compete with the big guy. And you know what? It's working and he's selling. And then someone else comes along and says, well, I have a better idea for a cooler running board or for a different side step or for a different, high articulation suspension system. And that's kind of the beauty of our, country and of our system, is that even when these big, huge gorillas with tons of $100 million war chests are doing this stuff, that little guy still has a chance because he can get on Instagram, he can get on Facebook, he can get on TikTok, he can get on the internet, he can partner with some influencer, and he can say, hey, I actually have a better idea. I built a better mousetrap and give me a chance. And somebody is going to give them their hard-earned money. They're going to buy that product, and then he's off to the races too. So I still think there is a glimmer of hope in all this, even with the EV thing.
Part of what's going on is crony capitalism, right? The people we elect aren't working for us. They're getting lobbied to death.
Yep.
And in a way, they're fighting for their survival, but we get sort of left by the side of the road.
I'll never forget, as part of my kind of volunteerism with SEMA, I used to go to this sort of Washington, D.C. activation we would do every other year, where a group of us volunteer leaders would fly into D.C. and the Washington, D.C. office that SEMA has would they'd set up these visits where you'd go visit with your local member of Congress, you'd go to your senator's office, and in some cases, some of our, and you'd be sort of like, I'd be there for California with half a dozen other volunteers from SEMA that are California based, and there'd be a Tennessee group and a Texas group and a Colorado group, whatever. And you go meet with your local kind of lawmakers, and you're petitioning on behalf of whatever sort of the hot button issue is of the day. And for many years, there's something called the RPM Act. And the idea, and I'm sure a lot of your listeners heard about it, SEMA pushed that thing pretty hard for many years, was really trying to sort of control EPA, who had started doing this overreach, where they were essentially trying to ban the construction of race cars. So these are, if you look at like emissions, the amount of emissions produced by all the race cars in all the world is so tiny compared to things like lawnmowers and cow farts that it's like not even on the chart. But I think for them, that was like a political thing where they could sort of point to it and say, look, we're getting rid of all these race cars that are causing all these problems, even though it's not a problem. So we were trying to sort of meet with members of Congress and senators to say, hey, this is an important bill. It's an economic driver. The communities around racetracks around this country, a lot of their, restaurants, hotels, fuel stations, these are all supported by motorsports. And the thing that was so frustrating for me on several of those visits was we would walk into these offices, and with very few exceptions, we'd be given a total cold shoulder. You end up, you're sitting in some big conference room in some fancy senator's office in the Rayburn building in DC, and you're meeting with like a 23-year-old junior staffer who couldn't care less about you. And there was one year where we were there at the same time as the Realtors Lobbying Association. And that's a big association, and they have a lot of money, and they spend huge amounts of lobbying dollars on politicians and giving to super PACs and giving to these political campaigns. We'd walk out after our 10-minute meeting with the 23-year-old, and as they walk in, there is the senator going and sitting in that same conference room.
Yeah.
It's because they bought that access.
Yes. Personally to you, Dan, what is rewarding about car culture beyond the business?
For me, it's mostly about community and about people. Most of my friends and my relationships outside of my immediate family came from the car community. And it's interesting. A lot of my clients are also friends, and maybe they were friends before they were clients. Maybe they became friends afterwards. A lot of the people I've met through the community have become friends over the years. But I'm sort of an omnivore when it comes to car culture. If you look at my nightstand, it's pretty bizarre, because I'm into traditional hot rods, I'm into muscle cars, I'm into late model stuff, I'm into import stuff. So I'm not like one of those people that like, I only care about one specific segment of the culture. I sort of consume all of it. But for me, it's more about the stories and about the people. And it's been very rewarding for me that over the years, as I've gotten to know people like you, and as I've gotten to know people like Randy Nonnenberg, who you interviewed a few weeks ago at Bring a Trailer, and I just like hearing people, everyone's coming from a different background, and some people were born into a car family and some people came to it late. I have some employees that are really incredible in that, like one of my employees is a young guy, didn't come from a car family at all. That was actually kind of a weird thing in his family that he was into cars, and he is a hardcore, he runs our digital marketing department, and he is as hardcore a fabricator as I've ever met, where he builds his own wiring harnesses. He plumbed his own turbo system on a crazy RX-7 build, like a drift car, completely self-taught, just likes figuring stuff out. One of our video editors, we had all these candidates apply for the job that were like Hollywood video guys and had all this like super high level TV experience or production experience. And this guy, Sean, comes along, had none of it. But he showed up for the interview in his Fox body Mustang that's like Mistachrome. Remember that color that's kind of purple green, like changes colors when
and like an iridescent.
Yeah. And he shows up and we kind of saw in the parking lot. We're chatting with him and he's a pretty quiet guy, so I wouldn't say the interview was particularly smooth. But then we went to leave. I said, hey, by the way, that's a Mistachrome Mustang. That's neat. I didn't know they made that car in that color. And he said they didn't. I'm like, oh, that's cool. So you had it painted? No, I painted it in my driveway. You did it yourself? Yeah. How'd you learn how to paint? I don't know. Just figured it out. Come look at it. Well, I go look in it and he swapped not only a 3-valve mod motor into it, he swapped the entire interior out of a later model Mustang into it, figured it out. And I went, if he can self-teach how to do that level of work, he's going to be great. And so kind of meeting people like that and meeting people who, I have friends that are car people that can't turn a wrench. They just like the culture. They like sort of being around it. But I know people that are like this crazy Rolodex of information where they may not know how to work on their own motor, but they'll tell you every model numerical designation for every engine BMW has ever produced. I like that kind of stuff. I think it's interesting just meeting people who get that passionate about anything, just because I like passionate people. So for me, that's the fun part.
So car builds, I know you've done quite a few builds in your time.
Yep.
What are some of the fun moments of that? Or like, was there any particular disaster that?
Oh yeah. The craziest one I ever did was when I was at Peterson and I worked for Rod and Custom Magazine. I was the technical editor and, I was sort of a muscle car guy. I didn't have a lot of exposure to the whole pre-war hot rod thing up to that point. I mean, it's fine. You can figure it out. And so I really wanted to get more immersed in it. And I came up with an idea that I pitched the editor where I said, I want to build kind of a hot rod that's sort of a budget build. And this was back when in like 2002, when the traditional hot rod thing was really blossoming. So up until that point, like, in the 80s and certainly into the 90s, hot rods had kind of turned into street rods.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden there's a lot of billet parts. There's a lot of like, teal paint and splatter paint and tweed interiors. And that was not personally...
Digital dashes?
Yeah, exactly. And that was not my personal passion. I mean, there was still a lot of it at the time at shows. Guys in Tommy Bahama shirts driving around with like, LED tail lights and, they're swapping on all this sort of late model parts that, I don't know, it wasn't my personal aesthetic. Well, all of a sudden, like these young guys started getting involved and there was this huge counterculture thing where all of a sudden they're listening to rockabilly music. They're building very traditional hot rods using mostly pre-war kind of scrounged parts, using much more traditional engines, flatheads and, early Hemis, and sort of the treasure hunt component of doing it the old fashioned way, finding those old parts, not just going to a catalog and getting a bunch of billet stuff, and doing it kind of the hard way. I thought that was kind of romantic. I thought that was very cool.
I remember pulling into Bob's Big Boy in Toluca Lake.
Big Boy. Yep.
Yes. Toluca Lake, Bob's Big Boy, 1999, 2000, and seeing some rat rods and traditional hot rods and going, wow, these guys really get it. Like,
that was the Shifters, almost guaranteed.
Oh, yeah.
That was the first car club that really focused on that in the country. They just had an anniversary, actually. It makes me feel super old because I think it was their 30th anniversary or something. But yeah, totally. Exact same experience. Toluca Lake Bob's, saw the Shifters pull in. Some of those guys like Aaron Kahn and some of those guys are still around. And they're driving around in like chopped Model A's. There was a guy named Axel Izzardi who had a shortened, chopped Model A 5 window with a blown Hemi, and the air scoop was higher than the roofline of the car. And
I remember that car.
It was crazy. And like, to me, that was like so cool. I wasn't that hardcore. I wish I was. But I went to my editor and I said, I want to build a traditionally styled hot rod and, and I want to document it in the magazine. That's a pretty straightforward idea, right? There's nothing crazy about that. Well, he comes back to me and said, oh, I think that's a great idea. You should totally do that and then drive it on Americruise, which was kind of the predecessor to the Power Tour. Well, that was in 34 days. And I'm like, wait, what? And he's like, yeah. That's going to be the story. Build it in 30 days and then drive it across the country. Well, I'm in my 20s at the time. Today, would I take that on? No. And I'd probably die if I tried. At 24 or whatever, yeah, let's do it. So I gathered up all the parts and I ended up building a 28 Ford, kind of a Lakes modified Roadster, which would be sort of like kind of like a Roadster pickup, but you take the bed off the back and you bob the frame. So you cut the frame off at the back of the cab. There's a little gas tank bolted to the back. So it's a little short wheelbase, almost like a T-bucket, but a Model A. I just, for ease of time, I put a small block in it with 3 2s. It was actually a beautiful car. I could have probably cheated since I was doing a 30-day build and just made it flat black primer like all those guys did and put a Mexican blanket on the bench seat and called it a day. But it was important to me that I didn't want to build, because back then the term rat rod was really frowned upon in the traditional hot rod community. They saw that as an insult because they thought rat rods were like the guy with the crappy Plymouth Volare that you painted primer black and had holes in the floorboards, right? They considered themselves traditional hot rodders. And so I wanted to build a car that was sort of a late 50s period correct Lakes car. So I ended up, I ended up working like 20, 22, 23 hours a day on this thing. I slept in it multiple times, 7 days a week, got it banged down 30 days. And it was a finished car. It had tuck and roll upholstery. It had a nice motor. It had a beautiful paint job. It was kind of a scalloped cream on root beer. It was a nice car, but I had done muscle car builds before, but I had never built a hot rod. I had never done anything that fast before. I mean, everything I had done was like a multi-year project. I was using parts that I had very little experience with, just kind of, so like when I built the whole, my dad helped me a lot. I did it in his, cause he's got kind of a big garage shop behind his house. So we did it at his shop, because I think at the time I was living in an apartment. I'm going to the hardware store and I'm just like buying bolts and nuts. And I mean, like literally and of course I'm a 23-year-old or whatever making, I think they called us the 24s because we were 24 years old. We worked 24 hours a day and we made $24,000 a year. So I had no money. So I'm putting all this stuff on my credit card. So I'm running up all this credit card debt. I buy all this hardware store hardware, which was mostly like made in China hardware. I didn't know what a nylock nut was. I didn't know what a stop washer was. So I'm bolting this whole thing together and it's done. I'm like, oh, this is gonna be great. Now the AmeriCruise was, we drove from California all the way through the Southwest, all the way through Texas, all the way through the deep South, over those like over the water bridge roads in like Louisiana and all that, all the way, and then we'd kick up the eastern seaboard and went all the way to Hershey, Pennsylvania, and it ended in Hershey. And so I mean,
at the Hershey meet?
At the Hershey meet. So we're talking like a 3,000-mile road trip.
Yeah.
I hit the road and immediately parts start falling off the car.
Of course they did.
And like the whole way, there's nuts and bolts and like hairpins, which are like a pretty integral part of the suspension, are coming off. The shifter came off in my hand and it's just shaking itself to death. And every night, and something that a lot of road trip people know, but not everybody knows, is you can kind of like camp out in a Walmart parking lot. And a lot of Walmarts are open 24 hours. So almost every night I'm in some Walmart parking lot. Everyone else gets, in our group of hot rods is going out to dinner and then they're going to the Holiday Inn to get sleep. And I'm in the Walmart parking lot scrounging up parts and laying underneath this thing. And there's a guy who's pretty famous in hot rod circles named Roy Brizio, who's a pretty famous car builder. And for the rest of my life, I'll have so much respect for Roy because even back then, huge car builder, super well known, had already built a couple of America's Most Beautiful Roadsters. This guy shows up on this event and he had a whole toolkit in the back of his 32 and he was laying next to me every night.
Wow. In
every Walmart parking lot, turning wrenches with some 20-something-year-old idiot that he doesn't know from Adam. And he's just laying there, turning wrenches, helping me fix that car. And when we finally got to Tennessee, there was a street rod parts company there. And thank God, like they had heard through the grapevine what was happening. And it's a company called Lokar. They're still in business. Yeah, like shifters.
Lokar.
Lokar. And Skip and Debbie Walls, I don't know if they still own the company or not, but at the time they owned it. Wonderful people. We got there and they said, hey, Dan, we have a lift cleared. We have an entire double stack of brand new domestic hardware, including all nylock nuts. We have 2 of our mechanics waiting. You guys are going to completely rebuild that entire car start to finish in one night. And so we put that thing up on the lift. We disassembled the entire car. We put the entire car back together with proper hardware. Everything was torqued to spec. and it ran like a top for the rest of the trip. And by the time I got back from that trip, the car was totally sorted and dialed in, and it was excellent. But that thing almost broke me. I mean, I remember somewhere in like West Virginia calling my parents going like, I don't think I can keep going. Like I haven't had a good night's sleep in like a week. I'm fried. I'm done. And they're like, no, come on. Like you got to just finish.
This was your vision quest.
It was. Yeah.
And think of how much more valuable that trip was because you didn't know what you were doing and your car was falling apart. And
Absolutely.
The relationships you built from that. That is an awesome car story, Dan.
Thanks.
I love it.
Yeah.
Dan, what about Don Prudhomme's shop? When you were a little kid, you snuck in there?
Yeah. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, there was a lot of kind of hot rod stuff happening out there. And my dad's shop was one street over from both a speed shop called Valley Head Service that was really well known at the time, and also Don Prudhomme's original race shop, the Snake.
Yep.
And so as a kid back then, I mean, little kids could just sort of wander around the neighborhood, and that wasn't weird. And I would literally just wander over there, and I would just wander around, and they're building top fuel dragsters, and they didn't seem to really care that I was there. They didn't even really interact with me. So I was just like the weird neighborhood kid crawling around a bunch of dragsters, and that was a pretty neat experience.
Did you just kind of stand in the corner, or did you ask a bunch of questions?
No, I was asking questions and climbing on stuff and touching stuff, and probably in retrospect annoying everybody, but they were fairly patient. They thought it was cool.
No, that's very cool.
I think it's great that you're now starting to see some of those programs coming online, whether it's the Piston Foundation, the Peterson Museum. There's a bunch of groups, I think, on the East Coast. You have like the Revs Institute. Like you have a lot of kind of groups that are now kind of, SEMA has done like Take a Kid to a Car Show for years, where I think thankfully now we're starting to get more people realizing that, hey, if we don't start actively getting young kids involved in this thing, the hobby is going to go away.
Well, what are you working on right now? You got what's your latest and greatest project?
I'm an addict. I can't stop buying and working on weird project cars. So I didn't actually intend to build another pre-war hot rod. I've got a couple of other projects. My wife's daily driver is a 57 Ford Ranch Wagon. And I've got a few other things. But I was actually on vacation with my family in the Pacific Northwest, and I got a text from a client and friend who said, hey, I have a line on a car that you need to be aware of, and it's a 32 Ford Model B Tudor, so a two-door sedan, which for me is important because it has a back seat and I've got kids. And what's interesting about this car is it's been in the same, it's only a two-owner car since 32. So the car's 90 years old. It's only had two owners. It's been the same family for like since the 50s. And I think it passed down from one generation to the next, and then the third generation owner passed away. So an estate sale was selling it, and my buddy called me and said, hey, I'm going to get a line on this thing, and I want you to end up with it. So we had to kind of move some stuff around, and I buy the car sight unseen. It shows up, bone stock 32 Ford. And if anyone is like not aware of what a 32 Ford technology level was, mechanical brakes, no hydraulics, friction shocks, 3-speed with no, synchros at all, total crash box trans. So just terrifying to drive. I got the thing. It's kind of a parade car. It was totally stock. I drove it to lunch like once and scared the hell out of myself and went, okay, this thing is like not suitable for road use.
Yeah.
But perfect, like perfect paint, perfect interior, mechanically perfect. And I'm going, my dad came out and looked at it, and he's like, you cannot hot rod this car. Like, it's too nice. There's so few original Henry Ford 32s that are all stock left. Please don't be that guy that starts messing with it. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. And then like a week later, body came off. I'm messing with it. So I can't control it. So yeah, it's a guy named Joe Nye up in San Luis Obispo is kind of a young car builder, and he's helping with it. He's a chassis guy. He used to work for Scandinavian Street Rods. So he built an all new chassis for it. I put together a 383 stroker small block with a 471 supercharger. Really neat guy named Joe Dyer from Dyer's Superchargers in Chicago, who's like, I think in his late 80s and has been building supercharger systems since the 50s, is still in business. And I had kind of heard about him, and I called him up and told him about this project. And he's like, I've got the perfect supercharger for you. I'm going to put it together. And he put this whole system together from like new old stock parts from the 50s. Most of the parts on this car, with the exception of, the transmission, which you really can't see, everything else is sort of period correct. It's got a sprint car rear differential, suspension. It's got all curved glass Stuart Warner gauges out of an Auburn. So it's mostly period correct. And then it's going to be about 650 horsepower, 2,200 pounds. So it's going to...
Wow. And aren't you preserving the original chassis? You're going to put it in a corner and...
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
So part of the reason, originally, I was going to keep it stock, and then I wanted to do a hot rod, but I was sort of concerned about, do I want to cut this thing up? And I really don't. And the car is just too nice. So so Joe Nye, the builder, it was his idea. Or, originally we talked about, well, maybe we'll just drop the axle, put juice brakes on it so it's safe, and then just drive it like that. And then it was his idea where he's like, even that though, you're still kind of cutting it up. So we literally just used a forklift and just lifted the body off the stock chassis, left the interior in it, like everything is stock, the roof insert, everything is original, and just rolled the stock chassis out underneath it. And we're just going to stick it in a corner at my shop, put it under a tarp, preserve it, built an all new chassis, and then just lowered the body on it, bolted on like it was meant for it. And that way I can go have my fun. And if we wanted to make it stock again, literally it's a one-day job, and you could just put the old body back on the old chassis and you've got your parade car again.
Nice. When do you think you're going to have it on the road?
So the goal is, and it was an aggressive goal because we started this project in January, and the goal is to have it at an event called the Gathering at the Rock, which is this traditional hot rod show at a really cool venue in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. So it's this like an oil guy had this ranch that has like woolly mammoth fossils and all this stuff. And they turned it into like a natural history museum, but it's got like woolly mammoths and Native American like art displays. And it's this kind of crazy venue that's like kind of a natural history museum. And they do kind of a Luftgekelt kind of thing, but for the traditional hot rod community.
Nice.
Where it's this like very curated car show. And it just looks really cool. I've never been. The photos look awesome. So I've been accepted. It's an invite-only show. It's a curated show. They saw the concept for the build. So the goal is to have it debut there in October.
In October. All right. Well, you got some work ahead of you. And by the way, I don't know how you get any of your own stuff done, your project cars, because you are one of the hardest working guys that I've ever met. And I want to thank you for having me in today. This is really fun.
Well, thank you. This was a pleasure, Maurice. I really was looking forward to it. And I also have to say, you broke in our new studio. So
yeah.
This is our new sound booth, and you're the first person to use it. So thank you.
It's terrific. If people want to learn more, it's kahnmedia.com, Kahn media.com. Dan Kahn, thanks again.
Thanks, Maurice.
That's all for this episode of Horsepower Heritage. If you like what you've heard, go to buymeacoffee.com/HP Heritage, where you can donate to the show. And tell your friends, write a review, because all of those things help me reach more gearheads like you. I will see you back here on Wednesday, July 12th for a story about the post-war years of Formula Racing and an ambitious little British firm that took on the big boys. It's a fascinating tale, and you won't want to miss it. So until then, I'm Maurice Merrick. Thanks for listening.